Right, I have my 4/1000th of an inch feeler gauge here, which is 0.102 millimeters, it tells me. So I'll just drop my rack into position there, slide my feeler gauge behind it, loosen that screw off and push it back towards the back of the camera, tighten the screw up and check the action of the rack. That feels nice and smooth. I'm looking at the inside of the body here to make sure that that bracket isn't pushed over to one side at all, that it's fairly well centered. That's pretty good. There's a stray cotton thread there I don't need, so we'll have that out. Check that rack again. That action feels okay. So we'll consider that piece to be incorrect. Correctly fitted. Now we'll go back to this piece. I just want to lubricate this piece with a little bit of graphite powder. The reason I'm using graphite powder and not grease or anything of that nature is that we have broad flat surfaces, fairly well finished, and if you were to use grease, inevitably you would end up with some stickiness there, some reluctance for it to move. So I'm just putting a touch of graphite powder top and bottom in there, and I'll work that a few times. Blow off the excess, and that's all that's required. We just need this action to work nice and smoothly, and we don't want any stickiness. If you get grease in there, it'll be sticky. It's only returned by a very small spring down here, and inevitably it would be sticky over time. Perhaps not immediately, but at some stage, particularly in cold weather, you would find that the thing would start to stick. So, we've got to get these components together now. So we have the buttons that go top and bottom of that section. They need to go in. And that needs to go in. This piece being part of the shutter release mechanism. I'm just checking, I've just dried these components off, but I'm just checking to make sure there's no moisture still in there. That all looks good. The springs for those buttons. 1. Oh, where's its mate? There it is, hiding. I take a little bit of synthetic grease, just run it around the inside edge of where the buttons run, and down in the little hole where the pin on the button runs. That's all that's required. So the springs go into the holes in these things, they do not go over the pins. If you put the springs over the pins, you are going to have a bad time of it. So just pop those into position. And holding those buttons squeezed in between finger and thumb, I can slide the lens standard into the shroud, push it through, and of course it just clicks into place. I'm just checking the action, make sure that's nice and smooth. That looks good. The lubrication in here, well, there's a rail here, a guide rail. Well, that needs to be lubricated with some synthetic grease, top and bottom. But in the middle, where these buttons contact the inside of this piece here, that needs to be lubricated too. So, again with the synthetic grease, start from the back, put some on that rail. Check the action. Take off that excess that's squeezed out the back. We'll just stick that back in the front. It's nice and snappy, nice and smooth. Now where the buttons run, particularly at the top, where they have to run back over this rangefinder slot, it's useful if that's got a bit of lubricant on it. And we can do the same from the front. Now you can probably see here, there's a bright patch here and here. Now that's from where? That's from these buttons, and probably some grit and dust has got in there, and the friction of those buttons popping up and into place has just taken the edge off that anodised section. That's by no means a serious problem, that's good. When this front section, the lens stand is in place, when the buttons are out, that feels nice and firm, there's no rock there, there's no problem. Here we have this piece for the film, the shutter release, that just slides in here so that it comes over the top of this thing here, and we slide the lens standard back into the shroud. That stops this from getting away, which is important. You don't want it dropping into the camera and causing you grief. Not so much at this stage, because this is early in the piece and it would be easy to rectify. That sort of thing happens later in the construction, then you've got an awful lot of pulling apart in order to fix it. So if everything's gone smoothly, this shroud, the whole assembly will go back into the body with very little trouble. And then we have 4 screws, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom, that hold that shroud in place. I'll find those now. At the base, we have 2 screws. Just checking to see that I've got the most appropriate ones there. These have been through the cleaner, so most of the adhesive and so forth that was on them has come off, but I can just tell that they are the 2 that most likely came from there. I'll just do those up lightly. And 2 at the top. These screws are typically being tightened up more than most screws in the camera, and quite often the heads on them are a little bit distorted, possibly from the removal process too. So those 4 screws are all in place. Now I can tighten them up. That's all in place. Now I'm not pulling the lens standard all the way out the front at this stage, because as you can see, as I move that backwards and forwards, you can probably see this piece of the shutter release is flapping about a bit, and it's very good at getting away. And so to prevent it sliding away, we'll put the shutter release shaft back in place. So with the lens standard still back inside the body there, we'll put the shutter release shaft in from the top. That's just sitting loosely in place. That of course traps that piece so it can't fall out. So now we can extend the front. That piece won't get away. If we didn't have this in place, you extend the front and there's a good chance this will take, that little piece of shutter release would take the opportunity to fall out. It would fall back through that space in there and end up trapped inside the shroud beside the bellows, and you'd have to have all of this out again to fish the thing out. But more importantly, you'd have to have all of this out to get the thing back in place, because it can fall out easily by itself, but you can never wriggle the damn things back in without disassembling things. So far so good. Well, I'll push that lens standard back inside the body, so that's effectively keeping that piece in place, and I can take that shutter release piece off there at that stage. Now this little bush can go back in there, that just holds the bottom of the film cassette. The film cassette just sits in this well there, and then the tripod socket goes on the top there, and the tripod socket is nice and shiny from the cleaner, and that just requires its 3 screws. Of course, you would have taken great note, if you're doing this job, you'd have taken great note of which screws came from there. They are not the longest of the screws, they're the second longest set of screws. And you're looking for 3 that match, and there's not a 4th one of that size anywhere on the camera. So I'm running the screws in lightly. Once they're all in position, do them up tight. That's our tripod socket back on the camera. At the top of the camera, you can think about the rewind shaft. There's 2 screws that hold it to the body. Here's our bush. And the centre section of the shaft, the piece that you pull up into position to allow you to rewind the film. So, using some synthetic grease, I'll run some into this bush. The design of this bush changed over time. This is one of the later ones. It's a plain aluminium bush, anodised black. There's a little brass insert in there which provides the detent to locate this shaft. It also is a bit wobbly. They're always a bit wobbly. Don't lose any sleep over that, that's quite normal. Some people get a bit worried about that. It doesn't mean things are going to fall apart. I'll apply some synthetic grease to this inner piece. There's a little spring around the shaft at this point here, and that just provides some resistance to stop the thing sliding around too much. It's getting that pushed into place. There's a little tab on the end of it here, has to go into a slot in the shaft. There it is. You can see it pulls up into position at that point. I can check the action of that part to make sure that it's sliding smoothly by putting the rewind knob back on and just checking that the action is smooth. And you should have more resistance at this point than at this point, so that the inner piece slides in and out before it starts moving the outer in the bush. That's all good. Take that knob off. This can go on the camera body. 2 screws, the same size screws as we used to hold the shroud into the body. And there's one further screw of the same size used elsewhere on the, actually it's used on the strap leg at the right hand end of the body. I'll do those screws up tight. That's our rewind all back in place. At this stage I'm going to slide the shutter release shaft back into position, and then I'm going to run a rubber band between that and the post here to keep it from getting away, and that in turn will stop that section down there from being able to escape and causing me grief. So all I need is my rubber band. So here we have it. We don't need much tension here, just enough to make sure that this thing's not inclined to get away. We don't want it getting away. Otherwise you'll tip the camera up and the thing will fall out, and next thing you know that piece would be escaping and causing you trouble. So that part's nice and stable now, and that's ready to have the focus mount installed. Pull this out to the ready to go. We have 4 screws that hold the focus mount to the front standard. They're nickel plated, round heads. We'll find those and get those in position. I'm short one. Where's the last of them? There it is, hiding. Run all 4 screws in lightly. When they're all in position, you can snug them up. That's all done. That's good. Next I need to look to the focus helical, the inner and outer. First I'm checking to see how well it's cleaned in the cleaner, and I can see that there's a bit of white dried wax left there. That's from the original grease, so I'm just scraping that loose. It's just sitting there on the surface really, and that'll be from the original grease. And it just hasn't cleaned away properly. That's okay. I'll just get a brush. Give that a brush to get that stuff off. It's just dry. I don't know what it is they put into grease, whether it's a clay-like substance, something like that. Right, so I'm just running the inner and outer together, and they feel a little bit rough. That's not uncommon. When they're dry like this, they'll sometimes almost seize into position and you can't move them at all. So, yep, as soon as I applied a bit of pressure, it rubbed up and it didn't want to move. That will be the metal galling where it rubs up. You get a little bit of unevenness on there, and it effectively just balls up and becomes a bigger problem. So what I've done is I just put a drop of naphtha on those threads and then work this backwards and forwards. Now naphtha here is just acting as a very light lubricant, and I'm rubbing these pieces together, and all the high spots are just rubbing away basically. And the action's nice and smooth. I've got to get these 2 pieces aligned correctly. Now I'd made alignment marks across them, and I'm checking the faces now to find those alignment marks. I can see my double scratch at this point and a single scratch there, but I'm out how much? A considerable amount. I've got to turn this to get that to get the timing of those two correct. That's close, but I'm back the wrong way, so other way, so I just need to move that one position. This is a multi-start thread, so there's a number of places it can start. I did count them once, can't remember what it was. Right, I'm looking at my alignment marks on the inner and outer helical here, and they're well out. I need that. Getting closer. Closer, another one. I can't feel that start position. That's it. So here I've got my alignment marks. You probably can't see it. I've got a double alignment mark here and a single alignment mark here. And they're aligned when these inner and outer helicals are flush at the front face. That was the point I chose to make sure that they were aligned at. I'm checking that the action is smooth at that point. You may find that occasionally the helicals move smoothly in one position, but they won't move smoothly in another. That looks good. Now that needs to be lubricated. So I have my helical grease, Helimax XP, what the hell do they call that? Helimax XP optical and instrument helicoid grease with lithium and PTFE, and I've found this to be quite good, and I apply this a small patch in about 5 positions around the inner, roll that in. I'm feeling for any roughness. If you overdo the grease, if you absolutely pack those threads with grease, it won't get smoother and easier to operate, it'll become stiffer because you end up with more drag from the grease. That feels good. I'll apply some to the outer surface here where this fits into the focus mount, and there are 2 tabs visible in the focus mount here and here. They're the guides that stop the inner from rotating as the outer rotates, which of course forces the inner to move inwards or outwards. And I'll pop this back in place on the body. Now I've got my alignment marks. I know I had the double alignment mark at the bottom, the single alignment mark at the top, so I know that I've got that correctly aligned in that mount, and I'm checking the action to make sure it's smooth. And you can see that the inner rises and falls as I rotate the outer. That's all good and correct. We've got the retainer that goes on there that holds the outer to the mount. Now you can probably see on that retainer, I'll get that angled right, there's 4 bright areas. Now they correspond to where the screws are that hold this down. That's the area of maximum pressure, if you like. And so I'm just applying my grease at those points. It doesn't need much. And then this can go into place. This only goes on one way. It's got 4 countersunk holes, so you'll recognise that those are at the front. There's a notch here that the arm for the rangefinder goes through, and you'll be able to see that that matches up. And this is held onto that with 4 screws, countersunk head screws. I'll just run that one lightly in place. On this camera those screws are black. More commonly these screws will be bright, nickel plated. But they are countersunk head. One last one and we'll be in business. There it is, hiding under a bit of rubbish. So get your 4 screws started. I've adjusted the position of the helical here so that the inner is protruding slightly from the front. You don't want it the other way, because otherwise you might bind this whole mechanism up when you tighten it up. Now tighten those 4 countersunk head screws. Check the action of the helical. That's nice and smooth. Now I'm going to close the front of the camera and we put in our 4 screws that hold the bellows to the front standard. These are black screws, quite long. They go towards the corners. They pass right through the focus mount, through the lens standard itself, and into the bellows. There's a plate in the front of the bellows that they couple up to get those screws started. When they're all started, they can be then tightened up. Now if we pull the front standard forward, the bellows will come with it. That's all good, and it's now waiting for the focus scale ring. And the focus scale ring is aligned with the alignment marks I've made earlier. And that's held in place with 4 screws. There are 2 slightly smaller screws that hold the ring on the front that connects to the rangefinder, so I don't want to mix these up. If you put the smaller screws in the bigger holes, they'll go in, they'll even tighten up to some extent, but you won't be able to get the bloody things to back out of the hole. I'll run these screws down. I just did that up very lightly indeed. When the 4 of them are in place, then I'll check the alignment of the focus scale ring with the outer helical. Make sure that my alignment marks look like they're aligned top and bottom, and then nip these screws up very lightly. If you do them up tight, what happens is that you will distort the outer helical and then it won't move smoothly. That's all good, that action feels nice and smooth. Next component is this ring here. This ring does two jobs. First of all, it couples to the rangefinder through this arm here, and secondly, it has this little fork here which connects with the screw on the back of the shutter and stops the shutter from revolving on the mount. This has been through the ultrasonic cleaner. As a result, it's been completely stripped of any lubricant. There's a pivot at this point. That pivot is just a rivet. It's quite rough and dry at the moment. I put a tiny drop of oil on that at that point and work that, and then that'll be nice and smooth.